In a modest Washington room during the spring of 1907, a woman passed from this life in solitude. No relatives attended her. No guests arrived. Adorning the wall above her bed, a lone portrait of Abraham Lincoln. She had entered the world as his property. By the time of his death, she had become the sole individual his wife could rely upon. Her name was Elizabeth Keckley. For 35 nights following the assassination, she remained at Mary Todd Lincoln's side. Subsequently, she composed the manuscript that Lincoln's own son devoted years to suppressing from public view. That narrative unfolds here. Welcome back to Behind the Throne. On the evening of April 14, 1865, a courier raced through Washington streets. Ford's Theater lay scarcely 2 blocks behind him. Inside the Peterson boarding house, Abraham Lincoln hovered near death. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, remained in the front parlor. Beyond consolation, barely speaking, recoiling from the approaches of every senator and general who gathered near. The nation's most influential figures found themselves at a loss regarding her anguish. The messenger had been dispatched to locate a seamstress. The woman who answered was Elizabeth Keckley. At 53 years old, she had been born into bondage in Virginia and had arrived in Washington less than 10 years prior with little more than empty pockets. She possessed no formal designation, no political standing, no established role in the proceedings of that grim evening. Yet when she entered that parlor, Mary Lincoln reached out for her hands. For over a month following Lincoln's death, through the death watch, the funeral ceremonies, the period when Mary refused to emerge from her White House chambers, Elizabeth Keckley remained the sole person she would admit. This constitutes a remarkable truth. Upon learning it, one naturally poses a far broader question. How does a woman born in bondage ascend to become the most trusted figure in America's most powerful residence? What bond could bridge such a divide? And what price, what genuine cost, accompanies loving someone across every barrier a nation has constructed between you? Tonight's narrative seeks to address these inquiries. Elizabeth Keckley, when recalled at all, is typically remembered as a dressmaker, the artisan who crafted Mary Lincoln's garments, a capable presence lingering in the periphery of a more significant existence. That represents an incomplete portrait, and it does her a significant disservice. She entered the world in slavery in 1818 within Dinwiddie County, Virginia. By the time she crossed the White House threshold, she had endured physical punishment, assault, and the battlefield death of her only son during the Civil War. She had secured her own emancipation, established a flourishing dressmaking enterprise in Washington, and become the trusted confidante of a First Lady who placed faith in scarcely anyone. Then she composed a manuscript, a work written with care and intention, explicitly aimed at rescuing another individual, a work that cost her nearly all she possessed. And that manuscript, 300 subdued pages, became the instrument that erased her from the historical record entirely. We commence tonight where we must at the origin, in a Virginia kitchen, in the year Elizabeth Keckley turned 4, when the world had already determined her value. This constitutes her narrative. Dinwiddie County occupies Virginia's eastern region, low terrain, tobacco country, a landscape of open fields and pine woods stretching toward the Appomattox River. By 1818, the county's enslaved population outnumbered the free, a pattern established over generations. This location marked Elizabeth Keckley's birthplace. She arrived in February of that year, within the Burwell Plantation's quarters, as the property of Colonel Armistead Burwell. Her father, George Pleasant Hobbs, was enslaved on a neighboring estate. His visits were infrequent, and he was sold away while Elizabeth remained a child. She spent subsequent years receiving his letters, Brief, cautious notes passed through unidentified intermediaries, and perusing them until the paper deteriorated along its folds. Her mother, Agnes, worked within the Burwell household as a seamstress. This proved significant, though Elizabeth did not yet grasp its full importance. Agnes possessed skills in cutting, stitching, and finishing. When her daughter reached an age to remain still, she commenced instruction. But first, there was the kitchen. Elizabeth was 4 when assigned to watch an infant, the child of a white household member. She exercised caution. She leaned over the cradle as a 4-year-old leans over something deemed important. She maintained vigilance. She made an effort. The cradle tipped. The infant fell to the floor. The infant sustained no injury. Elizabeth reached for it immediately. However, the mistress already stood in the doorway, and the response was not measured against the infant's safety or the child's motives. It was measured against the reality that household property had been compromised, or nearly compromised, and a small girl stood nearby who could be held responsible. She endured it. Survival offered no alternative. She stored it away with the distinct precision of someone who comprehends, even at 4 years old, that memory ranks among the few possessions immune to seizure. The Burwell household operated as thousands across Virginia functioned, with enslaved labor integrated into every aspect, and with the understanding that those providing such labor existed entirely at the pleasure of their owners. The rules remained unspoken. They required no articulation. Elizabeth absorbed them as children acquire language, through complete immersion, through observing consequences, through the continuous quiet adjustment of behavior against risk. At age 7, she witnessed something that rendered that world's logic fully transparent. When I was about 7 years old, she would later write, I witnessed, for the first time, the sale of a human being. A boy named Little Joe, the plantation cook's son, a child she had known her entire short life, was the one selected that day. He was brought into the room, she recalled, with a bright expression. He remained unaware of what was unfolding. He was placed upon scales. His weight was measured, and he was sold, she wrote, like the hogs, at so much per pound. Elizabeth observed. At 7 years old, she watched the mechanism operate. She understood, with the clarity children sometimes possess regarding the most brutal realities, that the same scales applied to her, that her weight had been calculated before she could speak, and that only the timing of the transaction remained uncertain. This represented no formal lesson. It was a demonstration. She did not fracture. She sued. Her mother had instructed her, since she could hold a needle steady, and by her early teens, Elizabeth's skills exceeded most. She could cut fabric cleanly, manage fit, produce finished seams that bore no resemblance to a child's work. Within the Burwell household, this proved useful. In the wider world she had yet to access, it would eventually become something greater. But that remained years distant. First came North Carolina. In her early teens, Elizabeth was loaned, as enslaved individuals were routinely loaned, to the household of Reverend Robert Burwell. The family moved between Virginia and Hillsborough, North Carolina, and Elizabeth accompanied them. She packed her meager belongings and departed. Reverend Burwell's kitchen featured a wall beside the door, and on that wall hung a rawhide. Each morning before dawn, when she arrived to light the fire, she passed it. She did not regard it directly. No need existed. She understood its weight, its range, the distinctive sound it produced against the nail when lifted down. It served not as a reminder. It simply existed, as tools exist, practical, accessible, poised for use. Within that household, a man named William Bingham, the local schoolteacher, a man who valued discipline, decided, for reasons Elizabeth could never adequately articulate, that she required chastisement. She had committed no offense. She informed him of this directly, which perhaps constituted the quality that inflamed him further. He seized a rope. He attempted to bind her. Then, in her own account, he took up the rawhide, and it cut the skin, raised great welts, and the warm blood trickled down my back. She did not beg. She did not weep by her own recollection until afterward. What she experienced in that moment, insofar as it can be discerned from the measured, restrained prose she applied to every difficult subject, resembled cold clarity. She was being punished for existing, and no tribunal would hear her case. What followed proved unexpected. Bingham wept. He felt shame, she wrote, shame, in the immediate aftermath, for his actions. He had beaten a guiltless girl, and some part of him recognized it. She recorded this without sentiment. She was not obligated to forgive according to anyone's timetable. What she did in the subsequent years was sue. In every household to which she was assigned, in every town, her reputation accumulated quietly. Merchants' wives learned of her. Women seeking superior work to what local dressmakers offered began to seek her out. She labored without compensation. Every cent belonged to her current owner. But the skill remained entirely hers. No one could appropriate that. She was constructing something. She lacked a name for it yet. She reached her late 20s before she began to comprehend what sewing might ultimately purchase. By then, she had been relocated again, to St. Louis, Missouri, to Hugh Garland's household. And she had a son, a boy named George, who had arrived under circumstances she would carry silently, deeply, for the remainder of her existence. But St. Louis also marked a shift, where she contemplated, for the first time, a figure, a specific, unforgiving figure, and questioned whether she could attain it. The figure was $1,200, and it represented the cost of her freedom. The boy bore the name George, and it was for him, as much as herself, that she would ultimately require every dollar of the $1,200. He was born around 1839, the child of Elizabeth and a white man named Alexander Kirkland, an associate connected to the household she served. Elizabeth did not discuss his conception, not then, nor for a considerable time afterward. What the record indicates, in the measured language applied to such matters, is that Kirkland's involvement was neither consensual nor challenged by anyone possessing authority to intervene. George possessed light skin. Light enough, as Elizabeth noted with the matter, of fact precision she applied to difficult subjects, that observers would not immediately recognize his legal status. Under Virginia's partus sequitur ventrum rule, the child's condition follows the mother's. George's complexion was irrelevant. His mother was enslaved. Therefore George was enslaved. The determination had been made before his first breath. She loved him as people love what they most fear losing. She watched him carefully. She watched the world around him even more carefully. When a man named James Keckley appeared, presenting himself as free, with steady employment and a composed manner, Elizabeth wrestled with accepting him, not from any lack of desire for companionship, but because she could not silence what she already knew. I could not bear the thought. She later wrote, of bringing children into slavery. She married him nonetheless. She possessed her reasons, stability perhaps, or the particular hope accompanying the prospect of something different. The marriage proved unsatisfactory. James Keckley turned out to be neither free nor particularly reliable. He drank. He struggled. Ultimately, he proved more burden than support, and they eventually parted. Elizabeth retained his name. It was the name she had selected deliberately, and she kept it as she kept everything, without fanfare, without explanation. What she did not do through any of it was cease suing. In St. Louis, Her reputation had spread quietly among the households comprising the city's social elite. She possessed a skill that could not be improvised: clean cuts, careful fits, and an instinct for silhouette that no formal training could have produced. Her clients sat in her workroom and entrusted her with garments for their most significant occasions. She worked extended hours. All earnings went to the Garland household. Yet her name was recognized, and within that recognition lay the outline of an idea she had been quietly developing for years. She required $1,200. The sum was not arbitrary. It represented the figure Hugh Garland had calculated for her freedom and George's. $1,200, and he would sign the documents. It constituted a substantial amount, beyond what she could amass alone, even if permitted to retain her earnings. She would require assistance, so she requested it. She approached the women she had dressed, the women who had stood in her workroom while she pinned hems, who had trusted her judgment regarding cut, color, and fit. She explained her need. She asked if they would lend it. 17 agreed. No enforceable contract existed, no collateral beyond her word. What those 17 women extended represented something closer to faith than credit. A quiet, informal acknowledgement of her character and her endeavor. She accepted it. She tracked every dollar with the precision of someone who understood that a single default would define her reputation permanently. On November 15, 1855, she placed $1,200 on a table in a small St. Louis parlor, in coins and notes, accumulated through months of calculation. Hugh Garland executed the manumission documents for her and George. She did not weep until leaving the building. She stepped into the November air, paused for a moment, and then permitted herself that release. The loans were repaid, all 17, methodically, over subsequent years. No creditor waited longer than she could manage. This represents the kind of detail lost in survival narratives. The sheer, deliberate precision of a woman who could have allowed some obligations to lapse and chose otherwise. She was free now. George was free. In the years that followed, she steadily worked her way toward a city she had been hearing about for some time. By the spring of 1860, she was in Washington. She had arrived with $2.50 and a willingness to labor beyond expectations. She established a modest dressmaking shop. She built a clientele. Washington was filled with women requiring skilled work and prepared to pay for it. She did not anticipate, in those initial months, that one of them would alter everything. The first time Elizabeth Keckley entered the Willard Hotel, where the Lincoln family stayed prior to the inauguration, she went at the request of a woman she had never encountered. Mary Todd Lincoln had learned of the dressmaker on 12th Street. Reputation traveled quickly in Washington among households, where appearance carried social weight, and Elizabeth's work could not be improvised. By late February 1860, Mary had received the name. The initial meeting focused on practical matters: fabric, timelines, and inaugural gowns. But something additional developed during that workroom conversation. Mary Lincoln held strong opinions about nearly everything, and she immediately recognized a woman who shared that quality. The professional arrangement commenced. Then it deepened. By summer, Elizabeth was regularly present in the White House, not solely for fittings, the constant demand of public life, but increasingly for other purposes. Mary conversed with her, not about fabric, but about the pressures of the White House, the isolation accompanying constant observation and rare understanding, the loneliness no official account would acknowledge. She called her Elizabeth. She spoke the name with something resembling genuine warmth. Abraham Lincoln addressed her differently. He noticed her, the composed woman moving quietly through his household, and formed his own assessment. He called her Madame Elizabeth, with a slight gravity, as if the title were entirely fitting. Elizabeth found this, she later wrote, more meaningful than he perhaps intended. Then the war reached her directly. Her son George had enlisted in the Union Army that spring. He served as a white soldier. His light complexion made this feasible, and was assigned to the 1st Missouri Light Artillery. On August 10, 1861, he fell at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. He was 21. The news arrived via letter. Elizabeth read it in her 12th Street workroom, where she had constructed everything she possessed. According to her memoir, a visitor arrived at the shop that afternoon. A tall man in a stovepipe hat who entered quietly and sat without ceremony. He remained silent for a moment. Then he took her hands. The President of the United States sat with the woman who dressed his wife, offering no condolences that would have seemed insufficient for the occasion. He simply remained. She buried her grief and resumed work. She knew no other way to proceed. 6 months later, it was Mary Lincoln's turn. Willie Lincoln, the president's second son, 11 years old, died of typhoid fever in the White House on February 20th, 1862. He had been ill for weeks. When it ended, Mary did not stand in any doorway. She collapsed entirely. Elizabeth was summoned. She arrived to find the First Lady in a state of devastation that no official language could contain, unable to eat, unable to converse with most people, unable to enter the White House rooms where Willie had been alive. She would not approach the green room, where his body had been embalmed. She sat in near darkness and refused to be managed. She was an altered woman, Elizabeth later wrote. She never again went into the guest room, where her son died, or the green room, where he was embalmed. Elizabeth sat at the foot of Mary's bed and remained. She did not fill the silence with consolation, because she understood that certain silences could not be filled. She had sat alone with her own grief in a 12th Street workroom 4 months earlier. She knew what that shape demanded. She stayed. Day after day, she stayed. It was during those weeks that Mary Lincoln composed a letter to her husband. If it had not been for Lizzie Keckley, she told him plainly, I do not know what I should have done. She meant it without embellishment. One afternoon, Lincoln came to sit with his wife. The windows remained drawn, the White House still enveloped in private mourning. Elizabeth was present. Lincoln rose, approached the window, and pointed through the glass toward a large white building, visible on the hill across the river. He addressed Mary directly. Mother, he said, and Elizabeth later recorded these words with careful precision. Do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there. He was indicating the government hospital for the insane. Elizabeth recorded this. She served as a witness. She wrote what she heard and deferred interpretation for later, as she handled most matters. Carefully, precisely, awaiting the moment when meaning would fully crystallize. She could not have known, standing in that room in the winter of 1862, that the moment would arrive. That Lincoln's quiet caution would ultimately prove prophetic. That his fear for Mary would materialize, and that when it did, a stranger would not be the one to arrange it. But that remained years distant. For now, there was the war, the White House, and the friendship forged in chambers where others' grief burned most intensely. 3 years remained. 3 years in which Elizabeth would stand beside Mary through more losses than either could envision. The final of those losses would not span years. It would arrive in a single night, with a pistol shot, and a courier racing through dark streets, and a parlor filled with powerful men who did not know how to respond. The messenger found her at home, alone, on the night of April 14th. She dressed quickly. A black physician named Dr. Anderson R. Abbott, the first licensed black doctor in Washington, waited outside to accompany her. The city was unsafe to cross alone at 2 in the morning, and whoever had sent for her had considered this. They walked together through streets, still illuminated by gas lamps, past darkened storefronts and silent government buildings. Toward the east side of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Peterson boarding house sat directly across from Ford's Theater. Upon arrival, Elizabeth observed light in the upper windows. She entered. The parlor teemed with men, generals, cabinet members, personal staff, the full apparatus of power, immobilized and helpless. Mary Lincoln was in the front room, barely coherent. She had already been brought to her husband's bedside once and had fainted, requiring removal. The doctors did not want her present when the end arrived. When Elizabeth crossed the threshold, Mary reached for her. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865. Elizabeth was in the boarding house when it occurred. She perceived the sounds moving through the rooms. The shift in tempo, the particular silence following a doctor's retreat from a bedside, and she understood. What she did next was hold on. For the 35 nights that followed, Elizabeth slept in Mary Lincoln's White House room. This was no symbolic gesture. Mary could not function without her. She refused food for extended periods, refused most visitors, refused to enter rooms she had traversed daily for 4 years. The East Room, where Lincoln's body lay in state, she could not bring herself to pass. She remained in the family quarters while official mourning proceeded below, and Elizabeth sat beside her in darkness and did not leave. White House staff came and went. Officials arrived with condolences and departed with paperwork. Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, Harvard-educated, composed by nature and training, managed arrangements with the controlled grief of a man who had concluded composure was the only useful contribution. Mary did not want Robert during those weeks. She wanted Elizabeth. By late May, she had to depart. A new president required the residence. She received 5 weeks, longer than protocol demanded, but the conclusion was unavoidable. She packed slowly. She was a woman sorting through remnants of a life that had been, despite its suffering, the center of a world. Elizabeth assisted with packing. She moved between trunks, wardrobes, and stacked hat boxes, folding and wrapping, speaking little, because nothing useful remained to say. What she carried out with her hands, the gowns, shawls, objects that had filled 4 years of a presidency, also constituted what she carried in memory. She had been present in these rooms when century-defining decisions unfolded. She had sat in a darkened bedroom while Lincoln and his wife argued, reconciled and grieved. She had witnessed all of it. Now she folded it into trunks and carried it downstairs. Mary departed for Chicago, then to other cities, circling without settling, diminished by grief, and increasingly consumed by fear of financial ruin. The Lincoln estate was managed by Robert, and Mary believed, with a conviction bordering on obsession, that she would die impoverished. She wrote to Elizabeth constantly. She required reassurance, presence, the one person who had stood beside her in every dark room. Elizabeth answered every letter. In the autumn of 1867, the two women formulated a plan Elizabeth would later describe with the careful restraint of someone recounting a preventable disaster. Mary required money. She possessed gowns, dozens, the official wardrobe of 4 years as First Lady, and believed they held value. They traveled to New York together in September to a Broadway consignment dealer to arrange a discreet sale. It was not discreet. Within days, the dealer had notified the press, and the press had manufactured precisely what it had appetite for a spectacle. The former First Lady of the United States, selling her dresses in a Broadway back room. The coverage was merciless. It was not intended to be otherwise. Mary returned to Chicago exposed and humiliated. The gowns that had cost thousands yielded almost nothing. Public opinion, which had tolerated her grief for 2 years, curdled almost overnight into something harsher. She was labeled calculating, grasping, undignified. She was, as she wrote Elizabeth, no longer anything. Elizabeth returned to Washington with a question she could not stop turning. She had watched Mary Lincoln be misunderstood for years. Misread by the press, misread by the public, reduced to a caricature of an unstable widow. She had been present in the rooms where the real Mary existed. Complicated, wounded, capable of extraordinary loyalty. And she was wary of the gap between what she knew and what the world believed. She had carried one skill since childhood. She had always known how to create something from nothing with her hands. She began to write. The book had a preface. Most books have prefaces. But this one opened with an acknowledgement that also served, in a sense, as a defense. Not of the writing, but of its necessity. I am well aware that I have invited criticism. Elizabeth wrote, in the opening pages of the work, that would become her most significant and destructive act. If I have betrayed confidence in anything I have published, it has been to place Mrs. Lincoln in a better light before the world. She meant every word. She had not written the book to expose. She had written it to defend. 3 years had passed since Lincoln's assassination, and in that time, the public had transformed Mary Todd Lincoln into something between a cautionary tale and an object of contempt. The dress sale in New York had completed what grief had initiated. The woman Elizabeth knew. The woman who had remained awake composing letters to her husband, who had organized relief efforts for freed people during the war, who had held her dying sons and been held by no one she trusted, had been supplanted, in popular imagination, by a caricature. Elizabeth took up her pen and wrote 300 pages in defense of the woman the world had decided to discard. The book was titled Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. It was published in the spring of 1868 by G.W. Carleton and Company in New York. Carefully written. Scrupulously qualified where qualification was required. A first-person account of her life and White House years. The grief, the friendship, the trust extended between two women across an impossible divide. She had shaped every sentence deliberately, selecting what to include and what to leave unspoken. She had not reviewed the final appendix. What she discovered, when the printed copies arrived, stopped her. The publisher had appended 24 of Mary Lincoln's private letters. Letters Mary had written to Elizabeth over years of friendship. Personal, unguarded, composed in the shorthand of two people who had ceased performing for one another. Letters about money, about her deceased sons, about Robert, about her fears. They had been shared with the publisher as background material, as narrative context, not as content. No one had sought Mary's permission. No one had informed Elizabeth they would appear in print. When Mary Lincoln read her own words in a published book available in New York, Washington, and Chicago, she experienced it as the final, absolute betrayal. It mattered not that Elizabeth had not authorized the letters. It mattered not that they had been submitted in good faith. What mattered was that her most private words were now public property. And the woman whose name appeared on the cover was the woman she had trusted with them. She severed contact with Elizabeth entirely. She never wrote again. She never saw her again. The press did the rest. The pretensions of an ignorant Negro mantua maker, wrote a reviewer for the New York Citizen in the spring of 1868, with the casual cruelty of someone who understood that certain individuals could be dismissed in a single phrase. Other publications followed. The book was not judged on its merits. It was judged on the impertinence of its existence. A black woman, formerly enslaved, daring to write authoritatively about a first lady's interior life. Elizabeth's dressmaking clients began to vanish. The women who had stood in her workroom for years, who had recommended her across Washington's social networks, found reasons to patronize others. One by one, then in clusters. The business she had built from $2.50 collapsed within months of publication. Robert Todd Lincoln, Mary's eldest son, a lawyer, a Harvard man, a future Secretary of War, quietly acquired the remaining copies of Behind the Scenes. Historians who have documented this period, including Jennifer Fleischner in her account of the two women's friendship, have established that Robert took sustained and deliberate measures to remove the book from circulation. His stated reason was his family's dignity. What he did not mention, what the book itself contained, quietly distributed across 300 pages that fewer and fewer people would ever read, was something else entirely. Deep in the chapter about Willie Lincoln's death, in the winter of 1862, Elizabeth Keckley had recorded what she witnessed in the White House family quarters. She had been present. She had recorded it with the precision she applied to everything that mattered. Lincoln had approached the window. He had pointed at the large white building on the hill across the river. And Elizabeth later recalled that he had said, in words she transcribed carefully, "Mother, do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there." He had been indicating the government hospital for the insane. In the spring of 1875, 7 years after Robert Lincoln removed the book from circulation, Robert Lincoln had his mother committed. He arranged the legal proceedings himself. He retained the doctors. He managed what the newspapers were told. Mary Todd Lincoln spent months confined in a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois, before her sister secured her release. Her husband had warned her in 1862 at a White House window. Elizabeth Keckley had recorded it in 1868 in the only published eyewitness account those private rooms ever produced. What the book had always contained from its first printing was a witness. And what historians have observed since, examining the sequence of events, is that the one document Robert Lincoln chose to suppress was the one that recorded, in a living hand, what Lincoln himself had feared would happen to his wife. The witness had been discredited. The book had been buried. And Elizabeth Keckley returned to Washington with nothing left to lose. She kept one photograph on her wall. The photograph remained on the wall after the book failed, after the clients disappeared, after the 12th Street dressmaking shop closed for the final time and the workroom was cleared of fabrics and forms. Through all of it, Elizabeth Keckley retained the portrait of Abraham Lincoln in whatever room she occupied, in whatever city she found herself. Through the decades following the loss of everything else, a pension arrived each month from the federal government. $8, later raised to $12, in recognition that her son George had died in Union service at Wilson's Creek in 1861. It was a modest acknowledgement of an immense fact. She received it without comment. In the early 1890s, she was offered a position at Wilberforce University in Ohio, head of the Department of Sewing and Domestic Science. She accepted. She packed the photograph and departed. The students who knew her there remembered a woman of composed authority. She taught what she knew as she had learned it precisely, with an insistence on correctness that came not from perfectionism but from understanding that skilled work was among the few things the world could not easily take. She had learned that before age 10. In 1893, she suffered a stroke. She resigned her Wilberforce post and returned to Washington. She had always returned to Washington. The city had been the center of her existence. The shop, the White House, decades of work. And it was where she understood herself to belong, even now. There was a place in Washington she could go. She had helped establish it herself in 1862, when the capital filled with the displaced and desperate. Women and children, black and uprooted, with nowhere and no one. The organization she had helped build, through the Ladies' Contraband Relief Association and subsequent fundraising years, had become the national home for destitute colored women and children. She went there in her final years and requested admission. She occupied a small room. She received occasional visitors. She accepted the monthly pension. She did not speak often of the book, or of Mary Lincoln, or of the White House years. What she had witnessed, she had recorded, and what she had recorded had been buried, and nothing remained to add to a record no one had shown interest in preserving. The photograph of Abraham Lincoln hung on her wall. On May 26, 1907, Elizabeth Keckley died in that room. She was 89 years old. She had outlived Lincoln by 42 years. She had outlived Mary Todd Lincoln by 25. She had outlived her son by 46. She had outlived the dressmaking shop, the book, the friendship, and the 24 letters that had concluded it. She was buried at Harmony Cemetery in Washington. In 1875, 2 years before Mary Lincoln was finally released from the asylum her son had placed her in, a reporter had asked Robert Todd Lincoln about the book, about whether it was true that he had worked to remove it from circulation. Robert neither confirmed nor denied. He spoke, as he always spoke on such matters, about his family's dignity. The book remained difficult to locate for decades. It was not republished in full until 1935. Elizabeth Keckley was not studied seriously in any academic sense until the latter half of the 20th century. In 1960, the city of Washington made plans to develop the land where Harmony Cemetery stood. The graves were to be relocated. 37,000 of them, the accumulated dead of generations of black Washingtonians. It was a substantial undertaking. Many graves lacked markers. Some records were incomplete. In the process of moving 37,000 individuals, certain names were lost. Elizabeth Keckley's grave was among them. In 2010, 103 years after she died in that small room, a commemorative marker was placed at National Harmony Memorial Park in Maryland. It informs visitors of her name. Her actual resting place has never been located.